Okay, team, here you and I are once again for your weekly episode of Solo Sam. Today, I'm going to talk about the podcast itself, how it's going briefly, then do the same thing for my training, a couple of developments there, some insights and some evolutions. And then I'll talk about, I'll answer some questions, some good questions this week. I'll go into sufficient detail to answer them. Firstly, let's talk about the podcast itself. As I indicated via Instagram, I put out my 20th episode this week, which was a threshold in my mind when I'd asked ChatGPT about what the typical attrition point was for podcasts, which is to say, what number of episodes does a podcast typically get to before it drops off? And what does that look like at scale? And the indication was that the usual drop off rate was 7 to 10 episodes, and that by the time that a podcast got to 20 episodes, there was an increased likelihood that it'd keep going. So in my mind, getting to 20 episodes was an important threshold to indicate to myself that we were up and running. And having crossed that barrier, I do feel like I've established momentum. Uh, that being said, there's still all sorts of uncertainties and unknowns in terms of how to evolve things, what tech improvements need to be made, what efficiencies in the process of organizing guests and having good conversations with them. So skills for me as a host that I'm constantly aiming to improve, but also the operation side behind the scenes. And I've been able to get some really good quality guests. And by good quality, I mean people that I wanted to talk with and had questions that I've wanted answers to, and guests that I were confident that others would find interesting. These are people that I would like to hear from on podcasts. And I've been able to get the vast majority of people that I wanted to talk to so far. The majority have not only said yes, but we've been able to arrange a time and have those conversations. What you don't see as a listener or as part of the audience is the times when people have not wanted to have conversations and sometimes not been able to articulate reasons for why that's the case. So in some instances, there has been reasons, and those reasons have been shared with me. I tend to say yes when asked historically because I feel confident to be able to have a conversation, and because anything that's likely to come up in the process of recording a podcast, if I'm the guest, I have an idea of what those questions are going to be. They'll be somewhat in my wheelhouse or at least tangential to that wheelhouse. And even if it's not, even if it uh, is unrelated, I'm happy to talk about it anyway. If it's something that I'm not interested in or I don't have a point of view, then maybe that would be an issue if and when we got there. But in my experience, that hasn't been the case. It's usually just a good conversation. And that's what I'm trying to provide for my guests. But I'm also not my guest. So I am trying to be appreciative of people when they have some reservations, to give them space to be able to say, hey, it's not for me, or to mull about it. And I've got a few of those at the moment. Some of those are because they're people that don't do podcasts. They don't really do long form interviews, and they may have their reasons for that. So that's something you don't see. You see all the people that have said yes and then eventually show up, and you see the end result. But there's some stuff that goes on in terms of not only asking people to come on the podcast, but there's a lot of people in different time zones, which means that sometime, for example, next week I have a day, Wednesday, where I have a podcast recording at 7:30 in the morning with one guest in North America, and then I have a podcast at 7:30 p.m. that night with a guest that's in Australia. And I've had people on from the UK, I've had people on from Africa, from the US, on both coasts, from Australia, and from New Zealand. And the time difference means that those are all over the place. Now, I tend to want to establish a bit of a routine when it comes to most of the things that I do, but when you invite someone on, you have to be flexible to what's going on in their lives because you're the one that's asking the favor. And if you want to make the conversation happen, then you're obligated to have a certain degree, when I say you, me, have a degree of flexibility and be okay with doing things in a way and at a time that is outside of my comfort zone. So that continues to be a thing that I'm seeking to evolve, and I'm looking at as a means of personal development, which is always great. There's a way forward in which less flexibility is required, but then there's different limitations. For example, if I were to only speak with people in person, if that was you may listen to, if you're a podcast listener, not of this podcast specifically, but in general, you'd notice that some podcasts do their conversations entirely in person. Some are entirely remote. Some are a combination of both, and sometimes in person, sometimes remotely. And because a lot of the people I want to speak to are in different time zones, different locations, other side of the world, because I'm in a rural area, at least 2 hours away from an Australian major city, there is a way in which you could access me if I had a studio space, which I don't. But if I did, there is a world in which I could have a location and obligate people to have the conversation with me in person, and I could have that at a specific day or days per week at specific times. But that seems like something that might come later if the podcast got to a certain size, but we're not there yet. And it would limit significantly the people that I would be able to talk to, which is the main appeal of doing it in the first place, to be able to talk to interesting people and to be able to share those conversations. So although I work with people that I coach in particular have adopted roles, work roles where I have to communicate with people across different time zones. That's an ongoing challenge in that's just part of this process, which you never know about because you just see when things go well. Sometimes when they don't go well is when send an invitation to someone. And I mean, I had, for example, the last 2 weeks, there's been a conversation I set up with someone and it's fallen apart for reasons on their end. One was a calendar, lapse of calendar organization. The other one, something came up for them and all you can do is be respectful. And in most instances in the real world, if I was working with someone that was not able to make an agreed upon appointment, I would designate that person as unreliable, and that may limit my willingness to work with them moving forward. But at this stage, because I'm the one asking the favor as the host, it's requiring a little bit more suppleness for me to be able to have the conversations that are the premise for this in the first place. You could happily be this one, no, unhappily be this version where it's just me and I'm talking and you're listening, and that's great. But I really think if we could leverage from the experience and insights of others in addition to this solo Sam variant of the podcast, and that's probably the best of both worlds. Challenges aside, I do feel like there is some momentum now and we're up and going. So The conversations are getting, I wouldn't say they're getting easier, but I feel more prepared, and I feel as though I'm developing my skills to ask good questions, to be more succinct with those questions, to listen more, to talk less. All of the things that you would hope for from a host and a conversationalist is something that I'm working on. Doesn't mean that it's perfect or anywhere near it, but I do think we're improving. That's the podcast. Now for training. I've realized in the last few weeks, because there's been some disruptions, I tend to talk about, hey, here's what's not going well, because if you were to assume that no news is good news, which is typically the case, so if I have news, perhaps it's not so great news. And because training hasn't, with my goals in mind, hasn't gone consistently enough or long enough to be able to report anything of note in terms of in-training performances, it's mostly just reporting to you, here are the disruptions, which is kind of a bummer. But I thought this week I'd indicate what is going well, in addition to the stuff that's not going as well. So stuff that is going well is I'm feeling strong in the movements that matter. And that's primarily the deadlift itself, because that's the strength goal that I have is a 300 kilo deadlift. I've lifted 300 kilos a bunch of times, maybe a dozen, and up to 320 kilos a handful of times. 300 kilos, very achievable, but I haven't done it at this body weight. And I also need to not be able to do it now, but I need to be able to do it either the day of or the day before a sub 3-hour marathon. So simply building my deadlift now is not the goal. It's building a platform from which I can peak my deadlift when the time comes. That being said, the movements that I'm training now to help develop that deadlift have been going pretty well, no complaints, low on the injury front, and good consistency in training with minimal, well, bordering on minimal volume. So my Romanian deadlifts, kettlebell swings, stuff like that, ab wheel rollouts, the stuff I'm doing in the gym, despite being de-emphasized and not requiring a lot of intensity and or volume at this stage, they've been going well and developing nicely, no complaints. The other thing is, despite the disruptions in niggles and sickness, my running economy / efficiency, which is just the effort or the heart rate at which I'm running certain speeds, is improving. So I've had this congestion sniffles for maybe like 4 weeks now, just lingering perhaps because I kept training when I should have stepped back, didn't want to step back because I'd already had to step back because of Cyclone Alfred disruptions. So off the back of that, my son got sick from daycare. I was basically just getting back into training when I got sick. So taking a break when I just had some version of a break was not something I've wanted to do. And because of that, this congestion is stuck around. And I know it's stuck around for me more than others because I've seen the other members of my family, my wife, my son, my daughter, all get some version of this and then all recover more quickly than me. No one to blame. This is just a matter of what it is. There's been a lot of limitation for me to be able to breathe through my nose at lower intensities, which isn't to do with the effort of the work, but just the literal congestion that I've had in my nose. So for those nose breathers of you, for the most part, I'm happy just to blow little spotlets of saliva and nose boogers onto my mustache and beard when training as a necessary evil. But when every time you breathe in, you're sucking back, and this is super gross, but here we are, sucking mucus back into your system, you just tend to mouth breathe more than you otherwise would. And so it's felt like this has been the case for weeks. Within the last week, that's been improving, but it's felt like a limiter. Nonetheless, what I've noticed is there's been improvements in running speed at the same effort. So if I'm trying to do a good chunk, the majority of my running at heart rates below 145, what you tend to notice is at a moderate effort and using the heart rate to quantify that effort, my running speed has improved. So this week, for reasons that I'll explain, has been a bit of a deload or a unload. I run only once. We'll run again today after this recording. For that run, which was only 20 minutes and post weights, but it was in the specified intensity zone, which is keeping it moderate, keeping that heart rate under 145 or functionally 150 with the average in the low 40s. That output, that speed is now getting into the sub 530 region, sub 530, which is to say 5 minutes 30 per kilometer running speed. Now that needs to get more like 430 per kilometer at that level of output, but you can't get to 430 unless you go 530 first if you're coming down from 6:30, 7 minutes, which is what it has been. So running efficiency is improving, which isn't speed in terms of how quickly can I run a 5K or a 10K or a marathon. That's all to come. What I'm trying to do now is develop the capacity to do that later. By moderating the intensity, which is a big portion of endurance training, it can't just be do every session as hard as you want, or you have to have speed limits in order to be able to accumulate volume at the right intensity. And at that intensity, speed is improving despite the disruptions, which is great. The other thing that I'll pat myself on the back for slightly is this week unloading or deloading. And I say deload, unload and not deload, because I would say deload is something that you do proactively. So say in 4 weeks from now, I would deload as part of the broader plan of fatigue management, which is something I can do, but what tends to normally happen and what's happened in this case is an unload, which is things had gotten to a point where it made more sense to take a step back this week rather than to push forward. One of those reasons was the sickness and congestion, where I thought, okay, if I've kept trying to train through it as normal and hope that it would go away, and it has improved, but it has not gone away. So I thought, okay, this week, because there are some other reasons, it would make sense to take a big step back with the hope of significant improvements in health, such that from next week onwards, I can actually train properly without being sick. And that has happened this week, although I'm not 100%. Maybe my Monday I am, but I'm not as of today, which is Friday. The realist in me accepts that the way things are is in part no one's fault other than it being my responsibility. So I have to live with things as they are and whatever frustrations come with that. But I made the right decision this week, even if it doesn't feel good, because I tend to want to keep training and keep training in earnest. But I took a step back, to have taken a step back in good faith with the idea that however I present on Monday, it'll be better for having had this unload, even if that's not at 100% health. The other reasons for the unload were and are that there's some stuff going on in terms of personal and family life, nothing bad, but just it means I have big responsibilities outside of work and normal family stuff and podcasting and training, which is already a lot. There's more than is normal. Requires me to do a fair amount of manual labor on our property and a fair amount of logistics behind the scenes. The main thing is been when it comes to training and unloading is these small overuse injuries. Persistent left knee pain, which is not too bad, something I can manage. The thing that hasn't been manageable is some shin pain, so borderline shin splints, particularly in my right leg, which I was just noticing more after leaning towards some slight aggression and intensity when it came to my running. As I mentioned last week, there was some overspeed stuff, which was very short and low intensity, but something about the way that I'm running, and I'd imagine it's at speed, I'm overstriding, and I'm also clearly haven't developed the lower limb durability that I need. And there's some additional mass, which I will elaborate on what I mean and what my thoughts are. But between the shin, and I also had a funny intercostal pec minor injury on my left side. So between sickness, knee niggle, intercostal niggle, life stress, shin splints, it made sense to just go, okay, we're not starting from scratch, but we definitely need to take a step back in order to take some bigger steps forward. And that's what I was speaking about last week with the 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of a thing that I've been dealing with. And I have been contemplating for a long time the extent to which I should be focusing on altering my body weight to improve running performance and durability versus focusing on doing the training and fueling the training and then allowing my body to adjust based on that. When I came into pursuing these goals, which was July 2024, I went in with the mindset of let's start on with low running volume. Let's modulate the body weight to get it lower to a point where historically I know I'm less likely to get the type of overuse injuries that I have historically got when running. And I'll also not have to fight as hard to improve running performance and efficiency because I'm carrying additional size. And some of the conversations I've had internally, I also will use whatever resources that I have online, which for me might be for some of you includes using ChatGPT or Grok or whatever other large language model that is available online to help inform and reaffirm my perspective. A typical inquiry might look something like, and this is because I had this conversation and I've written it down here and can share it with you now. So this is me asking ChatGPT, when running, what is the percentage increased risk of injury per additional kilogram of body weight? ChatGPT, when it comes to running, research suggests that each additional kilogram of body weight increases injury risk by approximately 5 to 10%, though the exact number varies based on factors like running volume, biomechanics, and whether the weight is fat or muscle. Here are a few key points from the literature. A 2007 study on recreational runners found that for every 1 kilo increase in body weight, the risk of running-related injury increased by about 5.3%. A higher body mass index, especially over 25, is consistently associated with a greater risk for overuse injuries, particularly in the knees, ankles, and feet. Impact force is increased by 1.5 to 3 times body weight per step. So each kilo adds significant cumulative stress over long distances. And because ChatGPT knows me, it knows what my goals are. So if you're aiming to run a sub 3-hour marathon at over 100 kilograms, bing bang, you're in a zone with a much higher load than the average marathoner, which I already knew, but not necessarily at a fixed percent risk per kilogram beyond a certain point. Risk curves tend to steepen once you pass a BMI of 27 to 30 in endurance running populations. Now, this is me as a caveat of how to reflect on body mass index, BMI, it's really useful at a population scale. It's less useful when it comes to the individual, but it serves a purpose here as reference. So I'm not looking at my body mass index, which is 30.6, which I think is obese or overweight, and thinking I'm obese and overweight. That's at 106 kilos, by the way, so 186 centimeters, and I was 106 kilos yesterday morning. So that's the number for body mass index. It's 30.6. And I don't put much stock into that if from a health perspective. But if they're saying that a BMI over 30 in endurance running populations tends to steepen the risk, and I'm above the higher end of that threshold, that's something that I ought to be attentive to. So then I ask ChatGPT, because I'm going to allow myself to be lazy with the mathematics, if I can compel the robots, ChatGPT, to do the work for me. So I said, what about 6 kilos? If I'm asking about each additional kilo, what about 6 kilos? Well, if we go with the conservative 5 to 10% increased risk per additional kilogram during running, then 6 kilo of added body weight would roughly translate to a 30 to 60% increased risk of injury compared to someone running at that lighter baseline. And give some caveats here, which is this assumes similar biomechanics, fitness, and running volume. The increase is not necessarily linear fit forever. The risk likely accelerates once body weight significantly exceeds what the musculoskeletal system is adapted to handle. Example, 90 to 100 kilograms in endurance runners, which I'm exceeding. So I'm in this danger zone. If the 6 kilo is lean mass, some of it is, and your movement quality is good, which it's not, but it's getting better, the actual injury risk might be lower than the raw numbers suggest. So say it's less than 30 to 60, but it could still be 20 to 30 or 20 to 50. In your case, targeting 100 plus kilograms with a sub 3, I'm targeting a sub 3 at 100 kilos. So it's sort of got that the wrong way around. You're in rare territory, but not automatically in danger if training is smart. Want to look at specific ways to buffer that risk? And I said, yes. ChatGPT, here are key ways to buffer injury risk when running at 100 plus kilograms, especially towards a sub 3-hour marathon. So it says prioritize strength training, stronger tissues handle higher loads, emphasize hamstrings, calves, glutes, and foot intrinsics, include plyometrics gradually to build tendon resilience, which is good advice. I'm doing the strength side of things, and particularly hamstrings, glutes, calves, and working on the foot stuff. So I'm ticking that box. Plyometrics gradually to build tendon resilience. I am doing some of that, but what I found when following advice like that previously is that can add also to the load, which then puts you closer to risk. So it's including the appropriate type and amount of plyometrics, which is what I'm doing. Optimize footwear and surfaces. Use max cushion shoes like a Hoka or Nike Invincible for high mileage days. I'm doing some version of that. Rotate shoes to vary loading patterns. I am doing that. Run on softer surfaces like dirt trails and tracks where possible. I'm doing that, which is to say I'm also doing grass and sand and dirt, but there has been flirtations with road running, which is ultimately where a sub 3-hour marathon will take place. But it seems as though the balance has been a little bit off because I'm dealing with these issues. Flirting with that risk of injury more than I need to. Next suggestion, build mileage conservatively. Cap weekly mileage increases at 5 to 7%. Follow a 3-to-1 loading pattern, 3 weeks building, 1 deload. Limit long runs over 32 kilometers in build-up phases. Go by time on feet instead. So I've been pretty conservative with the mileage increases on aggregate over time, but sometimes there's been more significant increases than others, in particular on hard surfaces. As of right now, since the cyclone disruption, I had 3 good weeks of training, even though that was itself managing these disruptions, including sickness and life stuff and niggles. And then this week has been an unload, which would follow that 3-to-1 pattern. So even if that wasn't the intent at the start, that is what has happened. I would say that I tend to aim more for a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, but perhaps being more conservative. So instead of a 10% increase in weekly mileage, it's more like 5 to 7. And instead of a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, 3 weeks building versus weeks unloading or deloading, I could perhaps be more conservative there. Limiting long runs, I'm not anywhere near proper long runs at the moment, but I will be mindful of not being too aggressive with that anytime soon. Shorten stride length slightly to reduce. This is improved running economy. This is the next suggestion. Shorten stride length slightly to reduce impact. Aim for a cadence around 170 to 180 steps a minute, and record form occasionally to correct inefficiencies. I've been mindful of shortening the stride length. That is something I have done because I know that shin issues are exacerbated or caused by overstriding, especially for a man or woman of my carriage. Along those lines, I also look at my cadence every run to aim for it to be higher in order to distribute that load through more steps, and to indicate that I'm not overstriding. It says here 170 to 180 minutes. I think that's a little too broad, given that it doesn't account for the size of the athlete or the speed that they're running at. But a higher number there is likely to decrease the bone stress and is worth aiming for. The challenge is that I can run in that zone, but when I do it at my current size and fitness, it tends to push me to a speed which I'm happy to run at, but then pushes the heart rate into a zone that's no longer reflective of it being low or moderate intensity, which is where most of the running at this stage needs to be. This is one of the conundrums of this goal. And for those of you that are trying to pursue long distance running aspirations, and particularly if you're a bigger body, this is something that you'll run into too. Monitor recovery aggressively. So track resting heart rate, sleep and soreness, use heart rate variability, subjective wellness, factor in non-training stress. Heavier bodies have higher allostatic load under volume. So I'll get back to the allostatic load, but I'm not tracking heart rate, HRV. I am tracking my recovery and my sense of how I'm doing subjectively. So how do I feel today? How is more so than what's my heart rate? I've done that previously. I'll talk about that more on a future podcast. But to say I'm monitoring recovery aggressively, yes, I'm doing that always. What I've probably not done that well is factor in non-training stress. So part of the background in the last few weeks is there's been more non-training stress than normal, in addition to building training stress. And the thing here that it's saying is heavier bodies have higher allostatic load under volume. And what allostatic load is the stress on your body from all sources, and that being higher when you have a larger body weight. So a larger body is going to accumulate more wear and tear at the same intensity as someone that's smaller. So I need to be more cognizant and more willing to adjust based on what's going on outside of training, is what the recommendation is here, and I would agree with it. Strategic cross-training, use sled work, cycling, rowing, or pool running to maintain aerobic load without pounding, maintain running specificity, but offload impact where needed. I have been doing that. The challenges come when I try to shift the balance in order to build running volume, which is necessary. So there is a lot of cross-training for this exact reason, that perhaps the balance isn't entirely right, well, the proof is in the pudding. So adjustments are required, and so adjustments will be made and are being made that will be respective of this balance, the balance of running volume versus aerobic volume, and what that looks like for different people at different phases, different sizes. For me, it means right now I need some running volume. I need that volume to build, but it can't be too much. So I need to be willing to do more of it via cross training than if not for all the issues I've indicated. And the last one here is mind, nutrition, and inflammation. Stay on top of protein and collagen. Tick, tick, doing that. Maintain joint-friendly nutrients, omega-3s, vitamin D. I'd say there's more to do with joint-friendly nutrients than that. I don't take vitamin D, but I'm very mindful of appropriate light exposure, which is really where you're going to get most of your vitamin D. Manage body composition. Lean mass helps, fat mass increases, impact forces more drastically. Okay, so lean mass helps, but obviously the number on the scale is relevant. So here we are, the conundrum. I've gone back and forth when it comes to this because although I know that at a lighter body weight, I can run better and with less injury risk, which is great, but also that I need to make some adjustments / compromises in my fueling in order to do that, because my body will run better at around 100 kilos, call it 98 to 100, but wants to sit a little bit heavier. So there's these, and I'm in support of this, people I've spoken to, people I listen to that would say, you need to fuel the training, and you're at your fastest when you're your strongest, and you're beautiful at any size. And I believe all of that, but then there's still the reality, which is at the start of this process, which is about 9 months ago, I thought, do I focus on training and see how that affects the body weight? Or do I focus on bringing the body weight down as the goal, even though that's not the performance goal? It might be a necessary goal. And the only reason I haven't done it is because I wanted to fuel the training and all of that. And also because I thought maybe as I added more volume, which I have done, then the weight would come down naturally, which is not what's happened. So the number on the scale has been about 103 to 108 kilograms. And that range is normal for me. If you're bigger and have more muscle, you'll get more change than within a day, within a week than compared to most people. There has been a lot of time when I haven't tracked the number on the scale because I was focused on the training rather than the body weight, and de-emphasizing the number on the scale, checking in with it occasionally to see where things were, but not getting weird about it. But realistically, that number needs to, for all the reasons that have been flagged, be more like 98 to 100 kilos. So we're looking at a 5 to 8 kilo drop. And the only way that's going to happen is to move from body weight maintenance, which is clearly where I've been. I would say I've lost about 20 kilos from peak. So at the start of the pandemic, when I was just trying to be as strong as possible, I was 124-ish. I think I saw 127 on the scale, but that would have been later in the day. I would say 124 was a realistic. So it's like 270 pounds for the Americans that like cheeseburger units. And I've lost about 20 kilos, 45 pounds from that. So this current body weight that I'm at is the product of being in a deficit over a long period of time, which has occurred in bursts, not a persistent deficit for 5 years. It's happened in chunks. And recently, as in the last year, maybe even 2, it's been more maintenance than deficit. And what's required one way or another is an actual deficit in order to move the needle, not because I feel great at this weight. I feel good. I feel strong. I feel comfortable in my own skin. But my goal is to run fast-ish for 3 hours. And in order to do that, but in order to do the training that would allow me to do that, I need to make some adjustments, or I can just keep smashing my head against the wall, or smashing my shins, as it may be, my knees, and I will accumulate more wear and tear than is necessary, but I'll also may not reach my goals. So we need to make a shift. The way I'll accumulate a deficit is not eating less every day, but on some days I'll have more of a deficit than others. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I wouldn't mind losing some weight or improving my body composition or lowering my percentage of adipose tissue, what is he talking about with an undulating deficit? Well, it's not about the deficit that you have every day. It's more, what is the deficit you have over the course of a week? So there could be 4 days at which you're at maintenance calories, which is just to say the amount that you're eating is the same as the amount that you're expending. And you're never going to be certain about this, but you don't need to be aiming for a deficiency every day. But in order for there to be a deficit, there needs to be some days where you're eating less than you're expending, which is a compromise on recovery. But the way that I'm going to attend to that is because I'm building back up from these niggles, and because I need to respect what my body can tolerate at the moment, even though we're many months into this process, I'm only going to have 3 hard training days with 4 days that I'd say are active recovery, but there would be training days for 95% of people on earth. But for me, I'm calling those days active recovery. So 3 days training, which is proper hard and or long training days, and then 4 days where they're still training, but it's about facilitating recovery and really amplifying the training days. So I'm pulling back a little bit on those days so I can push harder on other days. And throughout all of that, the run volume is going to be relatively low. So it's probably a ideal point of time if there's going to be a deficit and a compromise to recovery. It should be now, as opposed to later when I need to build volume for my goals. The other thing I'm going to be mindful of is the way that stress impacts inflammation, impacts weight retention. So low stress equals low cortisol, high stress equals high cortisol. The higher cortisol, the less willing your body is to use fat for energy. So part of the way that I'm going to be lowering stress is by having less training days and be more cognizant of these days that really are there to facilitate recovery. But overall, it's with the idea that although I'm reducing calories, which is a stress, if I do it in a otherwise low stress environment, which is more beneficial to my hormonal aspects, to creating inflammation, if I can better, as I mentioned earlier, calibrate my training workload relative to my life stress, then the amount of stress overall is less, and the willingness to liberate adipose tissue for energy is better, and the process goes more smoothly. This is all because my body is getting to a point now where for it to be lower on the scale is shifting into territory of it where it doesn't exactly want to be. Where I am at the moment is homeostasis, which is relatively easy to maintain because my body weight is where it wants to be, which means I can eat until I'm satiated. I can feel sufficiently energized in training. And all of that is great other than the limits which I've already expressed. The way I'm going to go about creating this deficit is a couple of ways. The low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, is just removing the unplanned, non-beneficial food that exists currently. So I'm talking, if I underpin good calories earlier in the day and I get to the point where after dinner, my body's saying, you're still hungry, then I'm more likely to eat food at a time which is further away from training. So my body is more likely to store that increased calories as fat as opposed to use it for energy. And I'm more likely to make poorer choices, which are calorie dense. So the thing that I need to do is to not do that. Part of that will be including more calories earlier in the day. So even though I need to eat less on aggregate, there's times I need to eat more, and then be wary of the times when I'm more likely to stray and to be organized enough and disciplined enough for that not to be the case. And I have to shift my mindset just a little bit because I've been maintaining for a while, but in order to create a deficiency, I need to go from this fueling training all the time mindset, which I need to, in the future, re-tap back into. But for now, I need to make this number on the scale of the project, even though I don't really want to, but because it will unlock and improve my potential for these other goals. Even talking about it at this length is because I've been preoccupied at times with the number on the scale, and because I've had big chunks of time in the interim where I've had a very healthy relationship and months where I've not looked at the scale at all and been fine about it. I don't want to lose that and reconnect with the times when, and I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but there were days in which I would get up, evacuate my bowels, get on the scale, and if the number wasn't lower than the day before, then I would feel as though that both yesterday and potentially the day to come, which had just started, were already failures, which is very unhealthy and not something that I want to get back into. But if the goal has to be for the current period of time, the number on the scale and body composition, the number on the scale is just a means to an end, but say that's the focus. If I focus on numbers in training, typically they're performance outputs. And so it's weight, it's speed, it's heart rate, and I'm calibrating based on all of those, how training is going. Now, if the goal for right now is the number on the scale, then that number becoming lower is success in training right now, which then means I'm in this position where if it's higher on a particular day, that may not feel as though positive changes are occurring despite the efforts I'm making, even though I know that not only is my deficit not going to be linear, so I shouldn't expect the weight to go down every day, because I'm optimistic that it might, so that I can get to the end of this phase where I can then refocus more on just the training. I'll just say here that, of course, I'm still focusing on all the training numbers. I just can't, for right now, be entirely blasé about the number on the scale because it keeps showing up as an issue. It's the number on the scale is limiting my ability to improve performance in the aspirational performance focus side of things, because it's limiting my ability to build training volume because of the overuse injuries. So I have to focus on the number. I have to do it in a way where I don't get weird, but I also want to see shifts so I can conclude this phase and move on to the next. Ultimately, I should have done this at the start, which I said I was going to do, and then shifted my mindset because of all of the reasons that you wouldn't want to do it, which is mostly from the opinion of people that have underpinned it at times and not been able to perform. And when I say underpin, they've underfueled training, they've run into issues. I've done that too. So it's easy to get into a mindset of, well, we want to always fuel training and don't try and modulate your body weight too much because that's going to limit your ability to perform because it'll limit your recovery, it'll limit your ability to express your strengths and on and on and on. And all that's true, but here's where we're at. So number on the scale has to come down. I'm going to do it without being psycho. And I'll let you know how it's going. Okay, enough of me and my training. Let's answer some questions. What's the best piece of advice you have received and why? Hard question in that there's lots of things I could say because I've received lots of good advice. But the thing that comes to mind is this, it's within Stoicism, it's referred to as the dichotomy of control. And it's basically just the recognition and the implementation of the reality that there are some things within your control, and then there's some things that aren't. The first time I heard about this notion was from my school coach, Dr. Andrew Randall, who's now a Olympic gold medal coach and the head coach of the British women's rowing team. And the way he phrased it at school when we were rowing was control the controllables, which is to say you can control how you row, you can control what sort of teammate you are, what time you go to sleep, your nutrition, but you can't control what your opposition does, and you can't control the weather. And so the things that you ought to focus on are only those things that are within your control, which means that the things that you need to not think about is everything else, which is helpful in sport, in rowing, but also helpful elsewhere. The challenge becomes the gray area in which things might not be within your control, but they might be within your influence. Case in point, when we didn't have power because of the cyclone at our house for 8 days, it felt like it was outside of our control because we were going to be relying on a crew to come and fix some down power lines, and I'm not anywhere near that decision making, and I wasn't going to fix the problem. But it also felt very depowering to just sit on my hands and hope that the situation would resolve itself in a timely manner, when it felt like perhaps if I made some calls and indicated my displeasure with the situation, then I could get a result that would occur earlier than if I didn't do those things. So I did do those things despite it not feeling like it made much of a difference. The power was turned on sooner than when it was suggested it might be. So I felt like this situation that most people would say is, okay, it's outside of your control. I felt like there was some capacity that was within my influence. And I often feel like that. There's these times when it may make sense to just let it go, but I feel as though I can provide some amount of influence and therefore some amount of control. And so that's what I do. That's the challenge. It's not perfect advice, but it is a way in which there's, for me to acknowledge that there are certainly things that are outside of my control. And those things is something that I shouldn't pay any attention to. And something that keeps coming up as one of the, not only the core tenets of Stoicism, but something that's really useful in life to be able to know what you should pay attention to and therefore what you shouldn't. So this is something I constantly do. And I also constantly negotiate the challenging gray area in between. And this is a longer question, this next one. I'm a club rower in the UK, entering what will be my 12th year of rowing and targeting my 8th Henley Royal Regatta. I often find myself adopting a more is more approach with regards to my training, trying to fit in as much as I can around my work and personal commitments, be it water or land training. There appears to be a trend towards bigger mileage recently. I guess this is a trend across all endurance sports, with club rowing athletes appearing to be doing more than ever in many of the bigger programs. A lot of the athletes, I suspect, having fewer or more flexible working hours to accommodate this. Not salty, just an observation from seeing people post training sessions during conventional working hours on the likes of Strava. Anyway, seeing as much as others are doing can be motivating, knowing that your competition is out there working hard, partly as a result of this, and perhaps also due to my nature, personality. I always find it tempting to cram in as much training in as I can, even if it sometimes means cutting sleep/recovery short. I usually average 6.5, 7 hours of sleep a night. This is usually because I'm getting up early to fit in a session before going to the office and then doing another session when I finish work. If for some reason I end up missing a session, example, get held up at the office, I find myself getting annoyed/beating myself up mentally, but perhaps this is part of due to me being overly ambitious and unrealistic with what I'm training and can fit into the week. You spoke in a recent episode about having conversations with yourself when it's a good idea to have a day off, particularly when ill. I'd be interested to learn more about what to do, I'd be interested to learn more as to what they look/sound like, what triggers you to have said conversation. What are the potential outcomes and options that you consider? Full day off versus a reduced training load/adapted session? How do you justify the drop session? Do you ever try to catch back up any missed work? I'm still getting faster year on year, albeit making small incremental gains on the water, in gym, on the erg, which I suppose shows what I'm doing is working, but I often question, is it optimal? Should I cut back on the volume sometimes and aim for quality over quantity instead? Really focusing on my recovery to maximize adaptation from these sessions. This would help to fit in with better life, but I'm nervous to do it in case of a drop off in performance. Really enjoying the podcast thus far. Thank you for putting the time and effort into making it. I'm finding the content both in it and your IG very useful and inspirational. Keep up the good work. Okay, well, thank you. I think your name is Tom. Tom, appreciate the feedback and your question. Okay, well, I understand why you're nervous. A couple of things to bear in mind, just for personal reference. My performance, which you can measure on the erg just because it's objective, the fastest I ever got on the 2K with a static 2K was in 2015, 2 years after I'd stopped rowing on the national team. And my training volume was significantly reduced because I had a full-time job, but yet I got faster. So that it is possible, but everyone's situation is a little bit different because I don't know the specifics of the volume that you're doing and the work you're doing in that and what your habits look like out of training. But I would say if there's scope to improve quality, even if that involves the reduction of volume, then there is scope to get better. And what do I mean by quality? I mean by you've got better improvements between sessions because there's more scope to recover and therefore adapt to the training that you are doing, which means that you can then push better numbers at the same effort within training, which is going to provide more training benefit than simply doing more volume. Some volume and perhaps a lot of volume is necessary, but it's this Goldilocks zone of doing the right amount and not doing less than that, but not doing more than that either. Your issue in part is that you're looking at the training of others and using that as a reference point. But as you've said, the other people, they may have different situation than you. They might have different work requirements, which is why they're able to train during typical work hours. You also don't know what they're doing outside of what they're posting on Strava. I do find it interesting that you're framing your club mates as the competition, potentially because you're thinking about vying for seats to make boats to compete at Henley. So you're thinking of your squad mates as competition, but realistically, the people that you'll be racing at Henley are your competition. your club mates, your peers, and if they're going faster and you can go fast too, then that is a good thing. Something to think about for you is to realize that what other people are doing only has a certain amount of relevance to you. I think that there's potential for you just because of what you've mentioned, the fact that your sleep is perhaps less than it could be. And then there's this time where you're beating yourself up, which is just a distraction realistically and takes mental energy, which is going to adversely affect your recovery on all the times that you're not making it to training. And you've asked about what's my internal dialogue? How are the decisions made? For me, when it comes to adjusting training, as much as possible, you want to make those adjustments proactively rather than reactively. So off the back of you hearing this, if you could look at your training program and think, well, what are the sessions that aren't really contributing to getting better, but are simply sessions that I'm trying to squeeze in order to feel like I'm doing as much as possible? What would be the sessions that if I remove them would allow me to show up into the sessions that remain better recovered and therefore more willing and more able to put in good quality work with a high technical emphasis? That way, you're not having to remove sessions when you get there because it's too many and because you're carrying too much fatigue. That's the difference between proactive and reactive. But if you're in a position when you need to make a reactive decision, it's being at peace with what is. So if you're held up at work, for example, you have to miss a session. Ideally, that session would never be there in a way in which your work could impact it. But because you're a non-professional athlete, just like me, we live in the real world, that can happen. Either have better discipline to not let the work thing, not let it disrupt your training plans. But I don't think that's realistic all the time. So if it's something that you can't adjust, then it's something outside of your control. And therefore, if you get annoyed and spending time beating yourself up about something that's outside of your control, then that's a waste of energy and something you ought not to do. So you just have to accept what is and then move forward. And you've asked about what happens when you move forward. Like, do you ever try and catch back any missed work? For me, not really. I encourage the people I coach that if they miss a session, there's no catching up, mostly because that tends to create more fatigue at some other point, which can then affect other sessions. There is some discretion in instances like this because some sessions are more important than others. So, for example, if you need to miss a Wednesday session, whatever it is, and you miss it, and on Thursday you have an easy session, and on Friday you have an easy session, maybe you do the Wednesday session on Thursday because it's important that you get that particular session done, and then there's still some buffer for recovery on the other side, say if Saturday and Sunday are quality sessions. What you don't want to be doing is ramming quality sessions in that you need to get in next to each other without respecting the reason that there are less intense sessions within a training program is because there needs to be some sort of undulation in order to manage fatigue and recovery over the course of a microcycle or a macro cycle, or either a week being a micro and a macro being, say, a month to 6 weeks. Could be even longer, but managing fatigue over a small time frame and then a long time frame is the reason that there are some sessions that are harder and longer than others. So you need to respect that when it comes to making up sessions. For simplicity's sake, I'd say don't do that. What you can do is adjust a session such that if you're stressed or tired, you can make it less intense and shorter. Perhaps something that facilitates recovery rather than something that creates more fatigue. And the way that I think about it is you have to check in with what's going on in your life and what your body is telling you, and then think about how close you are to your goal. And if that goal is further away, then you need to be more willing to make adjustments and more able to make those adjustments to be able to play the long game. Now, if you're closer to competition, you might have less flexibility. If you're in a trialing period, then you're in a squad, there's things you might need to do, but you have to use discretion when you can use discretion. For you, I think it's the most important thing is going to be the headspace piece. Being confident enough with yourself to see that what it might look like if you do less. I reckon most people and most rowers, on average, particularly the people that are going to write a question of this depth and detail to someone like me, where you're trying to get to the bottom of this problem, I don't think that you're trying to avoid doing the work. I think you're willing to do the work, which means that you're more liable to doing more work than is necessary, which means you might benefit from doing less. When you're sick, do less. If you have a niggles, then do less. If you have work stress or work disruptions, then do less. Ultimately, be prepared to do less, not in order to make things easier for yourself, but in order to still have quality and intensity when it makes sense, and then overall to be able to adapt and improve from the work that you're doing. You have said that you're still getting faster year on year, but the progress is getting smaller and smaller, which is the nature of things. And I see that you see doing less as a risk. What is the case for you and me, for everyone else, is that as you get to a point of training volume, if you increase that volume, you don't get a proportionate increase in performance. It's less and less for the more work that you're putting in. And the risk of injury and overuse and just general burnout, which is, I think, can come from a lot of places, but nothing's going to burn you out more than feeling like you're trying harder for less results. So to make the process sustainable, to make the most of what you're actually able to put in, requires you to do enough and not more than enough. And then to have the confidence that that's the approach that you should take, even if it feels like you're taking a step back. You can always do more that isn't training, that's going to allow you to be more flexible. So better nutrition, better sleep, better mindset, breath work, mobility, soft tissue work. All of those things will have influences on your progression that aren't more training and don't require, like, this is stuff you could do at work. It get influenced in the time that you're at work that isn't just more training before or after. So I hope that's some helpful perspective. Okay. Next question and last question for today. Question for the pod. Cheers. And I will say this is a national team rower from May country. I often have trouble winding down and can go through patches of a few days where I don't get a lot of sleep, and he's saying 5 hours. I know that sleep is the best recovery I can get, but sometimes knowing that just adds pressure, which snowballs into worse sleep. Are there any meaningful ways to recover that are comparable to sleep, meditation? Or am I better just trying to continue looking for ways to turn my brain off when going to bed? Okay, so the thing you've alerted here that seems like it's important you're aware of, which is that you're having trouble winding down. So you know that you're at a state that isn't suitable for sleep, and you're having a hard time transitioning from this active, I'm training all day, I have important goals, I have more training tomorrow. That mindset, which occupies most of the waking minutes that you have, is something that you're carrying to bed with you, despite the accumulation of fatigue. And I can speak to this because I've been there myself. Are there any meaningful ways to recover that are comparable to sleep? Or am I better just trying to continue looking for ways to turn my brain off when going to bed? You do both. And the main ways to go about this are routine and sleep hygiene. The routine is to say that you should have a order of events where at the end of those events is sleep. So much like training itself, when you're going for a row, you're having your breakfast, you're driving to the boathouse, you're doing your stretches on land and warming up, then you get in the boat and you're doing your boat warm up, and then you're doing your pieces on the water. You've got all of these events that lead up to the quality work on water. It's not just wake up and then that happens. There's a series of events. And once you get to the end of those events, things are more predictable because it's happened in sequence. You want to do the same thing with sleep. You want a series of events that increase the likelihood of everything occurring in sequence, and the end of that sequence being sleep. And the best way to do that is to have a routine. And that routine, I think, starts with when you eat and what time. So for sleep, one thing that I had to come to terms with is that eating, you want to cut off your eating before sleep. If you listen to someone like Brian Johnson, that lunatic guy that doesn't want to die, it's not all bad, but a lunatic. He stops eating, I think, at 12 p.m. each day, and then doesn't eat the whole afternoon because he thinks it positively influences his sleep. It might be because he's starving, but I heard from Dr. Kristen Holmes of Whoop. She was the first person that planted the seed that for sleep performance, stopping eating 3 hours prior to sleep is going to improve the density and quality of your sleep, which is more important than the volume. So it might not be possible for you with your training requirements or as necessary for you to stop 3 hours before sleep. I don't stop eating 3 hours before sleep. It's more like 2. But what I noticed that if I'm eating just before bed, that tends to have an adverse effect. You might not might not need to have as much of a buffer, but you might benefit from having your main meal as far away from sleep as possible, and then being mindful of the foods that you eat. You just don't want to go to bed with a full tummy of food, because if you think of the processes that your body needs to undertake, digestion is a costly process. And if your body is digesting, it's not resting. So meal timing is part of the routine. It's also something that can have a positive influence on your sleep if you're mindful of that timing. One thing you can do to improve recovery is to go for a walk after dinner. Walking after all meals is useful for nutrient partitioning, which is to say to move the food that you are eating into using for energy or for recovery, as opposed to for storage. So it's moving the energy moving glycogen into your muscles as opposed to fat store. On balance, it's going to make a small shift. It's not going to be a thing that it solves your problem. It contributes. So you eat dinner earlier, you go for a walk, then you're going to be mindful of light exposure. So in our house at night, everything is really dim. We have a red light from a lamp in our living room. The lights in the kitchen are dim and everything else is dark. You want to do that because even in particular, artificial light throughout your house can be indicating to you and your system, we're awake, we're awake, we're awake. And then if you're hoping you just turn off the switch and then your body goes, oh, okay, shit, it's nighttime, we'll go to sleep. You need to encourage your body in that direction, and adjusting your light environment is the easiest way to do it. Along those lines, if you have a phone and it's blaring in your face, that's blue light directly into your eyeballs, which is indicating the same thing. Hey, we're awake. So you want to minimize phone use. To have a hard cutoff an hour before is a good idea. I would say don't have your phone in your bedroom if possible. You may need it as an alarm, but I would say get an alarm, have that in your room, put your phone somewhere else, eliminate the problem. You can also adjust the settings on the screen of your phone such that it is more red light and less blue. You can dim it, all those things, but it's better just to avoid it entirely as part of the sleep hygiene aspect. When you're, there's a few more things you could do, like soft tissue work and stretching as part of the routine. When you're in bed, and you can include this as part of the routine, so you're brushing your teeth, you're not looking at your phone, dark lights, you've eaten a while ago, you've gone for a walk, you've done some stretching, some soft tissue work. When you get in bed, there's two things I've noticed that, and I say notice, it's not just that I've noticed with myself, it's that when I was working for Adidas/Adidas, that I had access to the recovery data on 1,200 athletes. And two of the things that really potentiated improvements in sleep performance, and sleep performance being measured by a higher HRV, higher heart rate variability, lower resting heart rate, lowering respiration rate, and increased percentage of deep restorative sleep. The two things that both helped that were breath work and reading in bed. Reading could probably be on a Kindle, but I think analog book pages, for a lot of people, that seems to put them to sleep. Breath work is a thing that can directly influence your nervous system, which is going to help this winding down component that you've alluded to. I could do a whole episode and might on breath work, but for simplicity's sake, if you spend 5 minutes breathing exclusively through your nose, where you're slowing down your breath rate and you're slowing down in particular the exhale. So if you were to take 5 minutes to breathe through your nose as slowly as possible, that would be sufficient. You could do that before or after reading, and that's really going to help you land the plane. So those things are occurring at the end of the process, and by the time you get to there, it should be you're turning the bedside light off, which is just going to be some lamp, or you want minimal light throughout this whole process. You're reading and doing breath work, or breath work and reading. I'd say do the breath work first, because by the time you've done all this, you might get to a book and you've read 3 pages, or maybe you've read a paragraph and you're already going to sleep. That would be a great result. One thing that is going to be helpful, because if in the instances you've done all these things and you're doing them consistently, but you still have nights where you're not falling asleep and you're getting stressed because you need to get up in the morning and do like 6 hours of training, and you need to recover, and your sleep's important, and so you're getting more and more stressed about the fact that you're not sleeping, which is making it harder to sleep. I understand what that's like. And one thing I did was to reframe my responsibility at that stage from I need to sleep, which is not something you can decide to do, especially if you're adding importance to it, my job is therefore to not to sleep, but it's to rest. And so if I'm in bed and I'm not sleeping, but I've pushed all these other buttons, then I can just accept what is, which comes back to this controlling the controllables. If you've controlled all the steps previously, that's all you can do. You can't control the result, which is sleep, but you can control your mindset, which is being at peace with what is. And if you can be okay with just resting, if not sleeping, then that probably will help you actually get to sleep if and when that occurs. Just try shifting your responsibility from I need to sleep to all I need to do is rest, because you can do that no matter what. Something that you can do away from sleep, but also when you wake up or when you can't get to sleep is yoga nidra. Yoga nidra is yoga exists. Well, it's depending on who you ask. Yoga is not just the practice, the physical movement, the asanas. It's a way of life, man. But there are different types of yoga that exist on a continuum between very active, which is more of a workout, to very passive. And at the end of the passive side of the continuum is yoga nidra, which nidra basically means sleep. So it's sleep yoga. And if you've done yoga before, you'll be aware of the posture, the asana, which is called shavasana, which is just lying on the ground facing up. And that often occurs at the end of each class, but there's yoga nidra is that's all you do. You lie on the ground, and there's often it's a guided meditation that includes a body scan. Sometimes it includes an intention, which is to say, what is the purpose of you doing this? And you could say, well, I want to relax, unwind, or go to sleep. And it allows you to do exactly what you described, which is to wind down and to better connect with your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest, as opposed to your sympathetic, which is your fight and flight. You're too sympathetic. You need to shift to parasympathetic, which is resting, relaxation, and nidra will help you do that. So if you were to do it in the day as a practice, hey, this is something that I do as part of my recovery, that will help you at night. If you can get better at relaxing as a skill, it's going to show up for you when you want to sleep. But it's also something you can do in the middle of the night. It might mean that you then need to get on your phone. So we've got a slight compromise there, but you could also manage the settings such that it's minimal, and you could do it in the least offensive way possible, where you're listening and not looking. You could do it as part of your nighttime routine, and it will help. All of these things, the breath work, the reading, the nidras, it's going to feel like some potentially fruity stuff that isn't going to make a difference, but it does and will make a difference. It has for me. I've seen the numbers at scale, how it works for other people, and it's one of those ones where you have a problem that's limiting your ability to not perform potentially, but to do the work consistently long enough so that you can perform when it counts, which is going to be in 2028 at the Olympic Games, realistically. So these are habits that you can, and skills that you can practice and build a routine around now, such that as training and as the quadrennium accumulates, this is something that you get better at, that you're more in control of. And doing these things is accepting responsibility for your process and your training and your ability to get better. And it's stuff that you either are willing to do or you're not. And often the stuff that an athlete does away from training is the thing that allows them to get better or not. I'll leave it with you. For those of you that listen each week, I really appreciate it. If you've got good questions, send them in. You know how to find me. If it's reasonable, I'll likely answer it. I'm here for you. I want this to be a resource for those of you that listen to the end each episode. So you're still hearing me now. I really appreciate it. I don't take any of this for granted. Anytime someone reaches out to say that they appreciate what I'm doing with the podcast, or that it's providing some benefit, that does spur me to continue doing it. So I appreciate you, and I thank you for your attention. All the best.